Welcome to the Diocese of Paisley podcast. I'm Patrick O'Hara, and in this episode we're going to be hearing about the process that's underway which could lead to the opening of the cause for canonisation for a hero of Scottish football, Tommy Burns. Tommy Burns played for and managed both Celtic and Kilmarnock football clubs, and he was also assistant manager of the Scotland national team. But it wasn't just football prowess that set Tommy Burns apart. He was a devout Catholic and a man of deep faith, and he wasn't afraid to talk about it. Tommy Burns died from melanoma in May 2008, aged just 51. His funeral was attended by people from across the footballing world. The then Rangers manager Walter Smith and assistant manager Ali McCoist were among the pallbearers at the funeral. But the story of Tommy Burns' deep faith doesn't end there. I'm here to talk to Chris McLaughlin, who's part of a group petitioning Bishop John Keenan of the Diocese of Paisley, where Tommy Burns lived, to open an investigation, also known as a cause for canonisation, into Tommy Burns' life and death, to determine whether he is worthy of being declared a saint in the Catholic Church. Chris, thank you for speaking to me today. This is obviously a pretty big deal, and I think our listeners will be thinking the same right now too. What do we firstly know about Tommy Burns and his life? It seems he was a man of faith, family and football.
Absolutely true. And Tommy, as many people will know, was born and grew up in the Calton area of Glasgow. He was born in 1956. He went to St Mary's he went to St Mary's Church. He was a regular churchgoer. That was his parish. And he went to St Mary's Primary School and then secondary school. He signed for Celtic Football Club at the age of 17 in 1973. And he debuted in the first team a couple of years later. And he had a very successful career as a professional footballer, and then in coaching and management as well. He was the manager of Kilmarnock and Celtic, assistant manager of Scotland and so on. But none of that in and of itself makes you a saint. What he's also remembered for is a life of extraordinary sanctity and holiness, which basically anyone who knew him seems to be able to talk about at some length. He was a daily mass goer. He prayed a great deal. His religion meant a very great deal to him, and he was someone who put it into action in a very real and concrete way, going out of his way to help many people and do extraordinary acts of kindness all through his life. And you know, there was one of the reasons this got started is that myself and two friends knew a priest who was very close to him, and right more or less from the minute after Tommy had died, he had been talking about how, you know, very forcefully, this man is a saint, and how, you know, people had to seriously think about taking that forward. Well, long story short, he managed to convince one of my friends, and one of my friends managed to convince me, and now we're working on it.
We know Tommy sadly died aged just 51, and he had a huge funeral at St Mary's Church in Abercrombie Street in Glasgow. The church hall at St Mary's was where the first meeting of what was to become Celtic Football Club actually took place. His funeral was attended by people from all across the footballing world. So that was back in 2008. What has happened in the interim period which has led us to the opening for the cause of canonisation?
Well, as I say, Tommy knew a great many priests. One of the priests which he knew, well, there were two in particular whom he knew, who are also people I know. And there was a priest, Father Robert Farrell, currently lives in Manchester. But Robert Farrell, right from the very earliest days, was insistent that Tommy was a saint. He was the person I was talking about a moment ago. And there is a sort of moratorium, if you like, on opening causes for sainthood usually for 5 years after someone dies. So for the immediate 5 years after their death, it's typically the case that this isn't dealt with. There are exceptions. The Pope has the power to dispense with that in certain circumstances. But generally 5 years is the minimum period of time. So once that period had elapsed, Father Robert had sort of been leaning on anybody who would listen that, someone had to really take this on and, really look into it. And one of the things that happened just over a year ago now is that a friend of mine, a guy called Philip Church, who actually was in the same parish as Tommy and knew him reasonably well, he and another friend of mine, a guy called Robert Doherty, they decided to do one of these Burns nights, which has become quite popular in recent years, in January, but instead of being dedicated to Robert Burns, being dedicated to Tommy Burns. Now, the usual format of these is to celebrate Tommy's sort of footballing career, but what they wanted to do was really concentrate on his religiosity and his life of holiness. Essentially, sort of as a sort of evangelical sort of enterprise, really, to maybe try and interest, maybe particularly men, perhaps, in how it's possible to have a very real spirituality in your everyday life and work. And what we decided to do is they talked me into helping them, and I'm the sort of person that gets involved in things. So we put on this dinner, Burns Night dinner, which, as I say, concentrated very much on Tommy's sort of religious thoughts. And we actually were fortunate enough to find some video that had been recorded where Tommy discussed that at some length, which most of the interviews which he did during his life were about football matters, as you can imagine. But anyway, a number of people came to that event, and I think it's fair to say it was a great success, and people got talking and so on. And it became clear that, there really is something there that needed to be looked at. And within a couple of weeks of that event happening, Philip, who had been sort of particularly moved by this and had been praying about it, decided that, we have to take this forward and really see where this goes. So he, Robert and myself then decided to actually sort of, in the first case, approach the bishop to see what to do next. So because Tommy died at home, Tommy lived in Newton Mearns, and Newton Mearns is in the Diocese of Paisley. So what canon law says is that the bishop of the diocese where the deceased person actually died, they're the person that has jurisdiction. So in this case, it's the Bishop of Paisley, currently Bishop John Keenan. So we approached him basically with our thoughts and so on, and he gave us some advice about exactly what to do next and so on. And what it amounts to is that in the first case, the bishop, Bishop John, will have to make a decision about whether or not a cause for canonisation is formally opened. And that's what we're currently working on. So at this moment in time, we don't have to prove just yet that Tommy actually was a saint, although we firmly believe that he was. But what we have to do is we have to show that there's good reason to believe that he might be a saint. And if Bishop John is convinced of that, then that he would formally open the cause, and then the process then really, Rome tends to, there's a dicastery in Rome that sort of tends to, they sort of become the officiating party, as it were. So there's a prescription set out in canon law about what we have to demonstrate to the bishop to get the cause opened. And essentially it boils down to two things in the main. The first is that we have to show that the person had a reputation for holiness and sanctity. We are very confident that we can do that. Almost everyone who knew Tommy to any degree seems to be able to speak to that point. And then the second point is we have to show that there is what's known as a cult of Tommy, which means that that's the word that's used. And what that essentially means to say is that people have been asking for his intercession. People who've been asking him for favours from heaven. Now, very early on, we met people who have been doing precisely that. So once we've gathered a sufficient amount of evidence and spoken to a sufficient number of people, what we will then do is put the case to the bishop, at which point he'll then decide if the cause should be formally opened.
That's obviously the faith side and what has to go on behind the scenes. Have you had any contact with Tommy Byrne's family? And if so, what has it been like working with them?
Well, very early on, in fact, immediately, perhaps the very first thing possibly that the Bishop John said to us was that we should speak to the Burns family, in particular Rosemary Burns, Tommy's widow. So we arranged to meet Rosemary, and indeed we also met the four Burns children at the same time as well. So right at the very beginning, the five members of the Burns family met with Philip, myself and Robert, and we sort of discussed with them what we wanted to do, how we would go about it, what the process would be and so on as best we could, what would be involved and so on. And they were very enthusiastic right from the get-go. So we were very, very pleased that they were in favour of what we were doing, and they agreed to help us as best they can, because obviously we have to speak to people that Tommy knew and so on. They knew him better than anyone, so they were able to point us in the right direction of people to contact, people to speak to, and so on. The other thing is that in theory there's no time limit on this. In theory you can take forever to get this done. However, in reality, as time goes on, these things will become more difficult. And unfortunately, in the time even since then, there are people who knew Tommy very well who've already died. And what that means is that we can't really anymore rely upon their evidence or testimony to take to Rome. So, as many people know, last year, Rosemary, Tommy's widow, she died quite unexpectedly. And she's not the first of people that Tommy knew that's now no longer with us. So if we were to leave this indefinitely, time, we're all mortal, and there's a limited window of time which we have to contact people and find out all the things Tommy did and get their evidence and testimony and so on. So this is one of the reasons why we were sort of motivated especially to do these things now, is that the clock is ticking in that respect.
Other than his family, what has the response been like from the footballing world? Because I believe that this would be the first ever football player or manager to be canonised. Yes, and in fact, I think more than that even. I mean, as far as I can tell, no professional sportsman anywhere in the world has ever been put on the cause for canonisation, as far as I can tell. And as you say, no footballer either. Tommy's unique in many, many ways. I mean, he would be, were this to proceed to fruition, he would only be the second Scottish saint since the Reformation. I mean, there's St John Ogilvie and that's all. So he would be in a very, very select group of people. And in fact, having thought about it, I can't really think of anyone else anywhere in the Catholic world who's been, raised to the altars, who was a celebrity in their lifetime for things other than the religiosity. So, for example, obviously St John Paul II was massively famous, but he was famous for being Pope. St Teresa of Calcutta was worldwide famous, but she was famous for her charity work that was inspired by a religious vocation. So those people were famous for, if you like, kind of
churchy stuff. But I can't really think of anyone who had such a degree of celebrity in a field outside of the church that has got this far. So I can't think of any film stars or sportsmen or anything of that nature. So he would be he's quite a unique figure in many ways. In terms of the response that we've had, I mean, Philip and myself in particular have been talking to many of the people that Tommy knew, players that he played with, younger players that he coached, the people that he just happened to know. Someone who really loved Tommy, who Philip spoke to, was one of the groundsmen at Kilmarnock, who had a particular affection for Tommy. So we've yet to meet anyone who said anything negative about him, which is an extraordinary thing. So from that point of view, as we were saying, and to speak to the 2 points that I was mentioning earlier, I mean, everyone we've spoken to speaks to His Holiness, and we know of people who have asked him for his intercession, and there are people out there who believe that he has interceded for them as well. So we feel that we're well on the way to being able to present a case.
So this obviously comes back to Tommy Burns being a man of deep faith. I'm too young to remember, but my dad always talked about seeing Tommy Burns at Mass at St Cadoc's in Newton Mearns. And I would have been about 4 years old, but it excites me to think that I was in the same church at the same time as Tommy Burns. What have the clergy you've spoken to told you about him?
Well, as I say, like everyone who knew him, everyone makes it very clear that he was an extraordinarily holy man. Funnily enough, I only met Tommy on 2 occasions, other than seeing him from afar from the terracing of Celtic Park. I started going to football when I was about 6 with my dad, and Tommy was in that team in the mid-80s. So other than that, I only met Tommy on 2 occasions. And on those 2 occasions, the first is that entirely by coincidence, Tommy's oldest daughter, Jenna, she was a couple of years below me at school, and we happened to go to the same school. And the headmaster, when he found out that he had a celebrity parent, in the school, I remember when I was in 6th year, Tommy was still the manager at Celtic Park at the time, so he was an extraordinarily busy man under incredible pressures. And the headmaster of the school, invited Tommy, and Tommy accepted to come into the school and talk to all the 6th year boys, as it was. Perhaps that tells you something about the era that the girls weren't invited. But he came in and he talked to us during an RE class, and just sort of did a kind of question and answer session with us for about an hour or so, where he talked about his life and the lessons he'd learned growing up and things he thought it was important for us as young men to know. The mistakes to avoid and various things. I was very impressed by him. And then, much like yourself, the only other occasion which I met him is, I remember one Sunday evening, I hadn't been to Mass yet, and it was getting late and you're starting to run out of options. And I remember going to, I think it was a 5 or a 6 o'clock Mass down at St Helens in Langside, and getting there just a few minutes before the Mass was due to start, and I sat down more or less in the back row, and about a minute or 2 later, Tommy Burns came in and sat down right next to me. And I didn't speak to my dogs. I didn't want to disturb him at prayer. I don't like people disturbing you when you're in the church. And I thought that would be kind of inappropriate. I think I might have shook his hand, at the kiss of peace. But I'm not sure if I did or I didn't. But those were the 2 occasions when I met him.
That's really interesting. Great stories you have from him. I guess the whole canonisation is it's a process, and it's going to take time, and we're just going to have to give it that time and pray.
Yeah, absolutely. ultimately, prayer is the most powerful thing in the universe. There are some sort of practical things that would help as well. So one of the things that we are keen, myself and Philip and Robert are keen to have people help us with, is that we are very aware that many of the things Tommy did in life, he kept quiet. He didn't go out of his way to seek publicity for them. So, for example, we know that, for example, he would come home quite late in the evening and someone would say, well, where were you? What were you doing? Or whatever. And he'd say, oh, nothing important. I was just seeing somebody or whatever. And then later they would discover that he'd maybe spent several hours visiting round the sick children's hospital or something like that. So we know that Tommy did some extraordinary things sort of quietly. And the nature of that is therefore that we don't know everything which he did do. So we're very confident that there are a great many thousands of people out there who probably have stories of Tommy Burns. And we'd like to hear about those, because those are going to be very important in the course of things and when we, as this case progresses. So, and also one of the things that Rome will ask for at some point is what are called writings of the deceased person. So basically what they do is they examine anything that the person has written to find out, like what their thoughts are and so on. But it doesn't necessarily just mean it doesn't necessarily just mean letters, for example. I mean, we know that Tommy did write letters to people, and if there's anyone out there who's got letters from Tommy Burns that they think would be relevant to us, we'd love to see those. But for example, if people will have, smartphones didn't really exist back then, but there'll be people out there who have home videos or photographs, like maybe in the hospital or whatever. Tommy came to visit them in the hospital and they've got photographs or things of that nature, stories they can tell us. To give you one example, we were aware of a case where someone approached a member of the Burns family once at a couple of years ago at some kind of awards dinner or something like that. And this person told the most extraordinary story, and he said that Tommy had saved his life. And briefly, the story is that this particular person was suicidal and very ready to kill themselves. And somehow or another, Tommy found out about this and talked the person out of it. And moreover, went to see him every day for several, a week or two or some time afterwards. Made sure that he was kind of back on an even keel and getting some help and various things. And this guy was very clear that, he basically owed his life to Tommy. Now, that's an extraordinary story, but here's the thing, we don't actually know who this person was, because, at the time, it's such, people didn't think to, take their email address or whatever. So, if that person is out there, for example, and I doubt very much if he's the only one who's got an extraordinary story, we would very, very much like to hear from those people, because we want to know about all those things he did that at this time are known only to them and to God. So if there are people out there that have those kind of testimonies, we would absolutely love to hear those, because they could well be all important in progressing the thing. Yeah, and the other thing to add as well is that all the people that we know that there's loads of people out there with those stories that we would like to hear from. And the other thing that, if it isn't obvious, is that you don't necessarily need to be Catholic to tell us what Tommy Burns was like. Obviously, most of the people that Tommy knew in life weren't Catholics, and we've spoken to many of them who were nevertheless impressed by his holiness and have extraordinary things to say about him. In fact, quite often, the most powerful testimonies in many ways have been speaking to people who were not Catholic or aren't Catholic themselves. And in fact, one particular person sticks in my mind that we spoke to, who was a a footballer who was good bit younger than Tommy. He was someone that Tommy helped to coach, and when he was younger. And that person told us that they are one of the people that told us that they actually pray and ask for Tommy's intercession, from heaven. And this is a person who isn't a Catholic. So there's no limitation on who we'd like to hear from. So anyone who can tell us about their encounters with Tommy and can testify to those things we spoke about, who has a story to tell, we'd very much like to hear from them, whatever their background or religion, whether it's Catholic or something else or nothing at all.
Is there any way for these people to get in touch with you as a group directly, or will they have to go through the diocese and contact you through there?
Well, what we're going to do is we're very shortly going to have a website. It's not up and running at this exact moment, but it will be in soon at tommyburns.org. But what you can do already is you can email us. So if you would like to get in touch with us, if you send an email with your name or phone number, email address, etc., and the details of what you'd like to tell us, if you send that to contact@tommyburns.org, then we'll be back in touch with you as soon as we can.
Thank you very much. That was great, really interesting to hear about a man who is an incredible footballer and an incredible man of faith. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the latest podcast of the Diocese of Paisley. Please like and leave us a review wherever you listen.